I won't say another word about Harry. Believe Nada. Enough!
This is Harry's last room at the Chelsea Hotel, which I filmed 4 days after his passing, on November 27, 1991. I was alone with him when he passed. He started singing, like an ancient, powerful chant. I'm dying, I'm dying, I'm dying. Died singing.
Adorana.
Genius is the act of making truly new connections, making or seeing connections which didn't exist before. Certainly Harry embodied that kind of genius. His musings on correlations and correspondences between musical, scientific, visual, anthropological, aerodynamic, anarchistic, linguistic, artistic, metaphysical, decorative, biological, practically the last pioneer.
Harry Smith moved into the court with his huge contraption, a wooden Trojan horse with a projector, 2 slide machines, and various other windows and knobs and things for his square, screen, triple, quadruple projections. And he has been screening his fantastic, Kabbalistic, and superimposition movies, and everybody is going nuts because these movies that he made 15 years ago are so fantastic. And his latest one that he made just a few weeks ago is the best of all superimposition, collage, or whatever movies. And he's crazy, nasty, and very brilliant.
Well, I think he was a genius. He was, to me, the only person I met, in my life that it transcended everything. I mean, he seemed to always be able to give you an answer that was really at the end of the line. You didn't have to go through all the shit.
Harry Smith autobio. Born in 1923 in Portland, Oregon, to parents whose folly regarding their gender led to cyclical social and religious mania, forcing Smith to accept his own duality with generous enthusiasm, and espouse the dualistic dictum of make a person think they think, and they love you, make them think, and they hate you. Naturally, the grandeur of his never-ending unhappiness, combined with his well-known greed, have provided many a private or corporate mecenas to finance his excursions into that blunted hunger on the boundary of voice and vision. He has made about 500 recordings for restricted scientific use, in addition to about 120 cuts commercially released, and has produced 23 films. His reason for coming to Boulder is to find out why he is such a damn fool, and has heard that Naropa is the best place to find out such things. The following symposia are announced. 1. The rationality of namelessness. 2. Is self-reference possible? 3. Communication, quotation, and creation. 4. The grammar of awareness.
He had this utter respect for every culture and society in the world, and a feeling that no one culture was superior to any other, that each culture had its own genius and was the manifestation of God. Each creative production, whether it was string figures or some extremely elaborate cultural artifact, and beyond the culture, that every animal and object and insect had as much value and interest as any other, that the human species was not to be considered as a separate or a better category than any other form of life.
He was staying in, I guess, a kind of church-affiliated glorified flats. I don't know what it was, but it was a sort of a system of partitions with mostly elderly men living in them, and there was a tremendously noisy environment at night with all of these old men hooting and groaning and snoring all night. And he was making a series of recordings of these things, which were really remarkable sounding music. And he commented, when he played it for me, he said, for the rest of this, the other side of this particular series, I'm going to record women giving birth. Harry and I had a private joke that he was one of the great composers of our time, and it was no joke. I mean, John Cage gave us Apparent Reality as music in 1952, and I think Harry took that a step further. He gave us Apparent Reality as symphony in recordings, recording the sound outside of his window with a good stereo microphone, and then in performance in an auditorium in a situation something like this, jacking up the levels so that everybody gets to hear New York City sounds like, the ambient noise of New York City amplified to the level at which we usually listen to music. And indeed it is music.
I'm fine physically. How are you physically here?
Now, could you go down and get a paper of pins for me?
A paper?
Never mind. How am I physically? I'm dying, my dear.
Oh no. Well, you're just not taking care of yourself.
It helps.
Well, what are you doing? Are you still working on another film?
Yeah.
Number what? Number
26.
Number 26. Was number 25 the fourth screen?
No, it's number 18.
He had designed some Victorian archaic frames which would project onto a screen, 4 frames on a giant screen. We'd have 4 projectors projecting different images, moving picture images, in color, simultaneously in certain random combinations that he'd designed in advance. An infinite number of combinations. And he gave only one live exhibition of Mahagoni, the filmmakers cooperative, back in the early But he was so angry and drunk that he actually destroyed some glass plate frames and the projectors. He had a tendency to destroy his own work.
You didn't have any of these editing programs. This was all actually physically working with film. So he had all these images, and we had slips of paper with the various images on them, and we had them broken up into people, animals, scenes, and nature. And then there was the palindrome that we used to assemble them. They had to be in a particular order: pasa, pasnapa, sapansa, pasapa. And you'd go through that, and you'd set up all those different images, like one after the other, in the shoeboxes. Then you'd start over with the series yet again. Each one of those pieces of paper stood for a certain length of a strip of film, and he would have to take each one of those strips of film and splice them all together. And there were quite a few of these things. So it was an enormous task, yes.
So you've done 7 films since number 18?
Number 23 is an ad. Confusion occurred there because the Seminole Indian patchwork film, a great amount of effort was put into that thing. I mean, Ralph Rinser is Smithsonian. Paul Busley says, we'd like to buy a print of the film that we paid for 20 years ago. And I said, oh yeah, I'm just editing it. He says, what, editing it? And but in the meantime, I have this string figure film with various characters from the Chelsea Hotel. I don't know, the usual people: Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe and Marty Bell and I don't know, Big Mama Thornton probably. The superimposed on Eskimos doing string figures on a Navy project.
Oh, that sounds wild.
At certain points, it comes out very good.
Mm-hmm.
He taped everything. He was an anthropologist interested in recording civilization, the presentation, all aspects of it, as much as he can.
This is another one of those things because I don't like being touched, which is like a catalog of designs made by this lady, beginning with the square ground, working through the 4 directions, and then to the diamond of the Earth's form, and made as a sample for sale of skirt designs, not at my suggestion at all.
By collecting the books, by collecting all the songs and music, he collected, and there are boxes of tin cans in the street crushed by cars. Then he did paper planes made by children in different neighborhoods, made by American children in white, American areas, made by black children in black areas, made by Puerto Rican. Then he stayed for, it could be ages, but it could be just 1 year, and he was really sick at Allen Ginsberg's place. Allen comes home one day, he discovers that Harry had drilled a hole in his window in the glass so that he could put out a mic. He could the sounds of the street in New York in 1980 at night, at 6 in the morning, 2 p.m.
And Harry was engaged with materials for the study of religion and culture in the Lower East Side, which included murderers babbling on amphetamine in the streets, jump rope rhymes, rap, complete canon of Gregory Corso's early poetry, all Orlovsky's songs, and the recording all of Magus.
And he taped hundreds of cassettes of sounds of New York, Lower East Side, simply from anthropological interest. That's
Harry talking about his collection of Ukrainian Easter eggs from Sing Out magazine. I've gone through about 20,000 eggs and have kept notes on each one. What I've been interested in are unconscious development of cosmographic notions that appear on the eggs. The eggs and the subject matter on them are connected with the shamanistic religion. I got one that had the rainbows woven into ladders, separating the underworld from the upper world.
Everything connected with Harry, all of his life, was his uncanny ability to understand the basic connections between things that were seemingly completely disparate forces and dynamics and magnetic interactions and terrestrial activities and geomagnetic polarizations and terrestrial dynamics that made culture, that made music, that made art, that made all of the things that were timeless. I mean, if Harry, did nothing, if he had only painted, if he had only collected any of the hundreds of collections that he made, if he had only studied one of the thousands of subjects that he'd studied, if he'd only influenced one of the hundreds of artists and scholars that he influenced, if he'd only made films, he would in any one of those areas be great. But he did all of it, and more. It's a man of unbelievable accomplishment, and his work is scattered. His films are intact, but his paintings are scattered all over the world. His influences are vast. He touched artists of at least 3 generations deeply. Harry is like a crystal mountain, and his work is there to be mined for crystal for all time. Radiates in all time. Harry is a hub, the way Da Vinci hub. Harry used to love to make me take him to yuppie restaurants for dinner. Stockbroker type restaurants we'd be walking. I want to eat there. He would go there and regurgitate. It was wonderful. I'd pay with my company Amex card. Harry would drool in his soup, and speak loudly and make the waitresses blush. No matter where he was, in whatever space he found himself, he made it gigantic. And it didn't matter where he was. He always found the treasures of the world absolutely under his feet. He heard things and saw things and tasted things and that nobody ever had before. If you were with Harry, you could discover something new every moment. And it was in complete disguise, right? He was, an occult master of the truest and highest sense.
One of the most advanced spiritual teachers that I have met in my life. He was so familiar with Crowley that he could quote him verbatim. His sense of humor was just the most profound and sparkling that I'd ever seen. He was always had like roaches crawling over various glasses and things. You'd like kill one or something and he would say, if you're going to ever kill a roach, do it very, very swiftly, because to them their lives are so short that their sense of time is totally different than ours. And if you hit one and don't kill it immediately, the length of time that they suffer is so profound for them.
Harry was continually testing your precision in handling the real world as opposed to the illusionary world, and would always get you at your weakest point, where you were most vulnerable. He was merciless. I mean, Harry really had no pity for anyone's bullshit. An instruction of how any higher being would deal with adversity. Oh man, you were with him when he died.
Yeah.
You heard him sing. You know how many beings go out singing.
Mm.
And dying, and dying.
And dying.
He arrived the morning after I was married, like an invocation. And he was carrying an Eskimo stone, wands, feathers, American Indian stuff. And he looked much older than when he died. His eyes were black underneath. His beard was dyed red. And he knocked on the door. I almost passed out. I thought the angel of death had finally come. Shortly after we met Harry, he stayed in our house for about 10 years, all the time except when he slept. And when he was at the library, which is most of the day. Then he'd come for dinner and stay till about 5 in the morning. Because that's all he did, come and talk fantastic things every day. Load something down a computer, you could bring it up.
You can do that.
He could bring it up, and he doesn't even remember reading it. Suddenly give a speech that should have been a professor of that subject at a university.
My experience is that Harry read every book that he had, or he was able to quote it. He picked selected parts at random on different days and was able to quote them or find them. He seemed to remember the publisher of every single book in his library, every book that he'd ever read, the date of publication. Anytime he went to a book, he would open it very precisely to what he wanted to show you.
Yeah, 56, which is an important number in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
And then my grandfather introduced him to string figures. So he devoted he had a tremendous collection of books on string figures. He knew more about string figures than anyone on the earth.
Also that Harry told you that he had made this, what do you call it, correlations?
Concordance. I call them operations, but if you take any string figure which is collected by an anthropologist, what they used them for was to trace pre-contact migration patterns. Because once you tend to learn something physically with your hands, you tend to do it the same way, and you pass it on. So presumably Navajo string figures are a lot like Eskimo string figures, Inuit string figures, DNA and Inuit. But you wouldn't think that that would be right until you read up your history and you found out that the DNA, or the Navajo, migrated down from just south of the Inuit about 1,100, 1,200 years ago and took up residence in the Southwest. But their string figures are still much like the Inuit string figures because of that. So the anthropologists would carefully note down exactly the hands dance which was necessary to do the figure in Tahiti, as opposed to Tokopia, as opposed to Nauru, so that they could figure out who went where and how. And so that's what they tried to do. And what Harry did was to take all of the information in all of the books of all the anthropologists and to analyze the figures and to make a concordance of, well, this is like the same thing over there, like the same thing over there.
You'd go to the library, look up all these things about these rabbis and sprout them. Then you'd go and look up all the magic squares and their different significances with the mathematical units, permutations inside the divisions and the planets, and bring out all kind of magical, medieval and early Renaissance magicians who were, serious philosophers in a mathematics that still makes no sense to anyone except magicians, and to me. And I was very close to it, because in Jewish Kabbalah, mathematics plays a large role. See, every letter has a number. And there are 27 letters, 22, 5 extra, say 27. And then if a word adds up to 163, and 300 pages later a word adds up to 163, then you see there's a connection between the words. It's a mathematical work that's beyond all imagination, the Bible. No human being could write that. Just on the mathematical unification of terms.
Whether it was like different kinds of cards or songs or pieces of music, the string figures or the paper airplanes, it was stuff that he was looking at. They all had their own sort of patterns. He just looked at different kinds of pattern languages. Languages don't just reflect like cultural concepts of reality, but they create them for people. Changing the languages, they're actually changing the way people experience their realities. All this stuff is a language that's being spoken all the time. It's like people themselves are like a speech, like a voice that comes into being and joins in with all these other voices. And they're not necessarily reading or speaking from the same place or the same text. In physics, for instance, they've got this thing where in quantum mechanics and stuff, they talk about the ground state, the vacuum, with particle fluctuation boiling off of this vacuum. And now people are talking about how it's not just one vacuum or one ground state, but you've got a whole bunch of different ground states that all these particles are coming out of. It's like a whole bunch of universes jamming together.
Harry Smith spoke of Giordano Bruno as the inventor of cinema in an aggressively hilarious lecture at Yale in 1963, quoting the thesis of De immenso innumerabilibus et infigurabilibus, that there exists an infinite number of universes, each possessing a similar world with some slight differences, a hand raised in one, lowered in another, so that the perception of motion is an act of the mind swiftly choosing a course among an infinite number of these freeze frames, thereby animating them. This is from P. Adam Sidney, Visionary Film. He also says, we see that he regards his work as belonging to the deeper historical tradition of magical illusionism, extending at least back to Robert Flood, who used mirrors to animate books, and Athanasius Kircher, who cast spells with a magic lantern.
Getting back to Harry and Bruno, this is like the 91 version of this thing, but Harry had photocopies and printouts and things from the book, and who knows where the heck he got them. You can see that in Bruno's Atria, with various lists of objects in the corners that perform operations on objects that are going on in the other corners. There's a sense of movement and transformation. And look at all the different operations and transformations that can occur between them. It opens up the possibilities. Because it wasn't just about composing graphical or lexical stuff. It was also about the fact that we don't comprehend ideas in one particular way. We comprehend ideas in very complicated ways, which is Bruno's foreshadowing of multimedia, which is what these guys were trying to get at. All this natural magic stuff with Porta and these other guys, like making odd noises, projections and such. It was all about having a whole bunch of ways at your disposal to convey impressions and information to other people. And that's another big thing that Harry was getting at. The way that ideas propagate across vast distances and influence other kinds of ideas. String figures and music and such, how they like run side by side and influence each other. He had it set up so that there were different slots for different kinds of ideas and different ways of like dividing up the page so that you could have one text that could be read in a whole bunch of different ways. You could read them forwards and backwards. You could read them upside down, like those puzzle books and trick books that Harry used to get, where you would have images going at the top of the page, and then you'd get to the end and you'd flip it, and it would turn out that it was animated. All kinds of different things that you would pick up that were buried within it. He was more interested in the magic theater end of it, the memory theater. When you think of the camera obscura, that's what a movie theater is. It's just one great big darkened room with a whole bunch of people sitting in it. And then you send in the train to run them over. What you've got then is a whole bunch of universes in discourse with each other, translating them into their own particular ways of looking at things, and then sharing those particular perceptions with all the other universes. He was examining the way patterns pattern other patterns. Now they actually have these disciplines like biosemiotics. I mean, the next thing you know, they're going to have quantum semiotics. Harry pointed out that Huxley describes mind at large as being funneled through our brains, which act as a sort of reducing valve or bottleneck for consciousness. And the magician wants to know, how do you get the genie out of the bottle or the light cone or whatever? Harry didn't just examine grimoires, he examined grammar itself. And you could see the resemblance of nature and language, of waves and words, and you could see that any wave upon the surface of being can access any of the rest of itself.
So I'm always happy for a picture of the Aborigines, but lately my possessions from that large amount of crap I had.
Where is all your stuff, Harry? Is it all in storage?
Where's all your crap?
Where's all my crap? 3,000 of the books were packed and about 1,200 of the records. The paintings, a special museum is being built for.
Paintings of Harry Smith Museum.
No, the Anthology Film Archives finally got a hold of the $1 million they needed for the matching grant. It took them 5 years, but they got it.
You do need a museum, Harry. Actually, with your folk collection and your tarot, do you still have your cards? Your tarot collection?
Oh, yes. I've added at least half as many again since I've seen you. The things that were lost in Cooperstown were a very large collection of tools that had been made there. Although I determined yesterday that the collection of keys that date from around 1700 to 1870 maybe, when Eagle broke the Corbin patent, etc.
What happened to those?
Survived. The jewelry survived. I'm not sure about the plastic jewelry, but at least the jet or gold or whatever did.
I never saw your jewelry collection.
It's never been unpacked. That's the funny thing, that I moved out of this former mortuary, and I have a good collection of their calendars, which are interesting, because they list every disaster imaginable on the calendar. Like the date the Titanic sank on, or the day that McKinley was assassinated. Like
That's
the ordinary
fun
list of things like 4th of July, the goddamn Engels.
Monday morning, just about 9 o'clock. Play country in the really rock. You look me crying. Guess I'm going to die. What they said when that great ship went down.
Harry was always into the process, and the one thing that I particularly remember, the most important thing about reality is the relationship of objects. That is what makes everything real.
Well, Harry was mainly an anthropologist, as he reminded me at my next to the last meeting with him. I'm an anthropologist, Lionel. Yes, Harry. You're an anthropologist.
This is Harry at 15, recording some Lummi chiefs at a powwow at the Lummi Reservation. His friend Bill Holm relates in one of his letters, I met Harry, I think in 1941. He invited me to accompany him to the Lummi dances, which I did for several winters in a row. Harry's invention consisted of adapting a standard disc recorder to use car batteries by means of a transformer, Recording was a painstaking business, requiring constant sweeping of the cuttings away from the needle. In this article from American Magazine in 1943, Harry says, "In an effort to write down dances, I developed certain techniques of transcription. Diagramming the pictures was so interesting that I then started to be interested in music in relation to existence. The rhythm of man is the rhythm of his heart. The rhythm of his heart is the rhythm of the day. The rhythm of the day is the rhythm of the earth. The rhythm of the earth is the rhythm of the rock. The rhythm of the rock is the rhythm of the molecule. The rhythm of the molecule is the rhythm of the atom, and so on to the ultimately physically describable unit." Harry Smith.
Hier in euren Städten ist der Lärm zu groß. Nichts als Unruhe und Zwietracht und nichts, woran man sich halten kann. Seid ihr einmal bei den...
I brought Harry to a party my grandfather gave every year in honor of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. You know, the day that he died, thousands of people go to his grave, that was 2,000 years ago, and sing songs and dance all night. So every year, what they did in Galilee, in northern Israel, my grandfather did here with such Jews who came from the city of Tzfas. After it was over, Harry let my grandfather hear himself on a tape. And my grandfather said to me, "Vusidus, what's this?" And I said, "That's," as if I knew, "a cassette." Right? I knew as much as my grandfather knew. Then Harry started to talk to him. This stuff should be remembered. It shouldn't go out of history. Why don't I come and record you? And so began a recording session that may have lasted 2 or 3 years. My grandfather couldn't speak a word of English, and Harry couldn't speak a word of Yiddish. But somehow or other, I guess they communicated.
How did you first come to know of Harry?
Oh.
Was it through film or through music?
Totally through music. In 1952, when Folkways Records issued the Anthology of American Folk, edited by Harry Smith. I bought all 6 of those immediately. It was a symposium in Washington kind of celebrating Harry Smith's life and his contribution to all kinds of things, and all kinds of scholars came around where in earlier years nobody had given a damn about Harry. It was back in 1969. I thought a lot about Harry, and so I did a long interview with him for Sing Out magazine. And each topic in there was an amazing, reflection of the things he'd been thinking about. I'm not sure which side of Harry I was talking to or hearing.
Was this guy a ethnomusicologist? Was he a filmmaker? Was he a specialist in spiritualism? Was he a specialist in brain research?
Yeah.
And Harry covered all these different grounds.
Once I got to meet Harry, what was fascinating about him, for me, was that he did all these other things besides music.
Here's a guy that spends his whole life collecting things and putting them out for people to see. And it's also, collecting, his films were made from collections. For example, the Heaven and Earth Magic feature that he made, he collected thousands and thousands and thousands of cutout images from the different catalogs from the 1890s, Sears and Roebuck catalog.
Yeah,
and he
yeah.
cut them all out, and he put them in different envelopes, and he labeled them in different ways, and ended up having a situation where that was how he made the film.
Why do you think he put himself through all this agony? Because, when he did it, I think it was agonizing, to just turn off all the world and just raise a mushroom or just listen to these things or collect these things. There wasn't a big human interaction there.
I think that Harry was interested in putting forth things that would allow other people to have a sense of the world as a unified whole and not as a segmented set of things.
One time I asked him essentially the same question I asked you. Why do you do all this collecting and so forth? And he said something to the effect of, well, it's like some kind of a compulsive activity that he does. It's like, you know, an earlier version of it is collecting things, or earlier is to make little things out of mud. He says, which goes back to an earlier experience like, you know, like playing with mud pies or playing with caca.
My cinematic excreta is of 4 varieties: batiked abstractions made directly on film between 1939 and 1946, optically printed non-objective studies composed around 1950, semi-realistic animated collage made as part of my alchemical labors of 1957 to 1962, and chronologically superimposed photographs of actualities formed since the latter year. All works have been organized in specific patterns derived from the interlocking beats of the respiration, the heart, and the EEG alpha component, and should be observed together in order, or not at all, for they're valuable works that will live forever. They made me gray.
We talked about the Carter family earlier. He told me that he had visited Sarah Carter of the original Carter family. She was living up in Angels Camp in California. That's before Harry came east, and he went up to visit her there. And I said, oh, what did you do with Sarah Carter for a day? What would you speak about? He said, well, I asked her to take out her quilts, and I photographed them, and I would ask her to give me the names of the pattern. He said, I was looking for correlations between the patterns and the names of her songs.
Running o'er the C&O road, just 20 minutes behind.
Like she would say, diamonds in the rough. Now she made a record called Diamonds in the Rough. So I was looking for a visual comparison between the two. I said, oh, that's interesting. And later on in the interview, we were talking about the different psychedelic drugs and mind-altering drugs. And I said, when did you first encounter peyote? He says, oh, someone saw it for sale in a Woolworths and 5 and Dime in San Francisco. He said, so we bought and ate it. I said, oh, and where'd you do that? On the road to Sarah Carter's.
It was nasty, you know. We used to crush these very violent, bitter buttons up, crush them and put them in these gelatin capsules and ingest those. And we were supposed to see all kinds of things. We got in this place and we're all sitting around looking in the fireplace, and they swore that Smith was going to appear.
He said that visual material is so much more compressed, has so much more information than written material, so that he liked to collect visual material because he could get more information quicker.
Oh yeah. A little rubber sheet with a balloon or something attached to a funnel and a tube, and you would talk into it, and it would record sound vibrations. Basically, what you're asking me about is something that Harry had from the turn of the century, being a mechanical contrivance that some wag had invented that would somehow, by having a rubber-type membrane that was flat and a way of introducing sound waves to this, you could put graphite or some other substance on the top and record sound waves in some sort of visual form. This is a form of translation of one phenomenon to another. The interesting thing about Harry talking about the sound thing is it had perverse, peculiar waveforms, so you could then make a grammar or phenomenology of these peculiar types of recordings of these peculiar types of waveforms, because it gave you more than one thing to work with. So you're able to like see a series and discuss the dynamics. I mean, I think Harry is essentially obsessed with dynamics.
Harry Smith from Sing Out magazine, 1969. The problems that I set myself on have to do with correlating music into some kind of a visual thing, into some kind of a diagram, being as my essential interest in music was the patterning that occurred in it. The type of thinking that I applied to records, I still apply to other things, like Seminole patchwork or to Ukrainian Easter eggs. The whole purpose is to have some kind of a series of things. The fact that I have all the Seminole designs permits anything that falls into the canon of that technological procedure to be found there. It's like flipping quickly through. It's a way of programming the mind, like a punch card of a sort.
I am a noted highwayman, cold younger is my name. With deeds and desperation that brought my name to shame.
My God is coming down.
Better get ready for judgment, for God is coming down. The cloud will be his horses when men begin to frown.
The legendary anthology of America's folk music came out in 1952. On its cover, the celestial monochord was shown being tuned by the hand of God, and printed over the etching were the names of the blues singers, hillbilly musicians, and gospel chanters Smith was bringing together for the first time. The booklet, a work of art in itself, a system flowchart of condensed information. As John Cohen says about a section of the anthology, the ballads, these are the major tomes, handed down from medieval times to ancient Britain, the traditional ballads. There is volumes of scholarship about them. Harry could get them down to one-liners is unnerving. Murder, disaster, demons, a lizard in the spring, the spirit of freedom, grace. As Harry himself did, I felt social changes would result from it. A quote from John Fay, 1997. Had he never done anything with his life but this anthology, Harry Smith would still have borne the mark of genius across his forehead. I'd match the anthology up against any other single compendium of important information ever assembled. Dead Sea Scrolls? No, I'll take the anthology. Make no mistake, there was no folk canon before Smith's work. That he had compiled such a definitive document only became apparent much later, of course. These were the true goods. A quote from Peter Stamfel, 1997. Have I told you that these records changed my life and the lives of thousands of others forever? This is the stone, the grail, the real deal, the nitty-gritty, ground zero. Long may it wave.
Had a huge record collection that of all different exotic, you name it, he had it. And apparently there's a magazine for record collectors, an ad that Harry had put in the magazine, wanting to collect certain types of music and advertising.
We met in 1948. Been collecting records independently for some years before that. We were both doing the same thing, taking advantage of the drive to collect old records. They needed to melt down the old records to make shellac for the war effort. And we were diverting whatever we could find. The things that he was collecting were blues and hillbilly, country, shit-kicking, whatever you want to call them. Those are the main things he was collecting, but we were collecting everything. There was an old man on Eddy Street who had a whole bunch of records, and there was this old store out in Richmond, I don't know, a few miles away from Berkeley, had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records, all from the early days of phonograph. And we go on a bus and we go out there and we never had any money. We have these dreams that someday we're going to get enough money, we'll just buy the whole store. One day we went out there and it had disappeared. We didn't know where it went or anything.
Harry decided that I was a worthy being and could profit from a short course in ethnomusicology. So Harry made 47 90-minute cassettes. These were just abstracted from his vast collection. It was the first time I'd ever heard Mongolian throat singing. It's also the first time I ever heard kora music. Harp lute of West Africa, amazingly beautiful instrument. The tapes were always very interesting. The form of them was that the two sides of the tape would be from very, very different parts of the world, from yodeling from Europe and yodeling from South America. Pipes from Bolivia. And pipes from Africa. But the music would be absolutely resonant. He said if I understood all that he had put onto those cassettes after listening and appreciating and understanding all the relationships and formal matters of the material on those tapes, that would be a reasonable introduction to world's music, and you could begin to study music from there. My standards, he influenced my standards, calibration curves by which one measures the worth of something. Harry provided another order of calibration.
Evidently all these first things are happening inside an egg. Shouldn't that be kind of swirled around, carried around like currents? Accented in the peyote ceremony as a whole is the experience, not the ceremony. A lady who was very, very old, she was told me that the hallucinations came from the back of the moon. So many composers have seen colors when certain music was played. Just the whole thing resembles a brain. Maybe we're just looking at ourselves. We will meditate for a few moments on life, love, liberty, and light.
Now the final award. In 1952, a creative and eccentric painter, philosopher, anthropologist, and political activist produced 3 albums of folk music reissued from recordings made by major labels in the 1920s and 1930s. It's called An Anthology of American Folk Music on Folkways. It became the resource for a generation of young performers. For that work, he's gone on to do many other things. To Harry Smith for Anthology of American Folk Music, 1952, and for his ongoing insight into the relationship between artistry and society, his deep commitment to presenting folk music as a vehicle for social change. It's my pleasure to present our certificate, our Chairman's Merit Award, to Mr. Harry Smith.
I have arthritis, so I had to have this young man help me up here. I flew in from Colorado. I think yesterday. Oh, thank you. I'm glad to say that my dreams came true. That I saw America change through music. And all that stuff that the rest of you are talking about. Thank you. You just sat and didn't move and worked and worked and worked and worked and didn't stop working and worked like a machine, a precisionist, on scratchboard a lot. The only example of that work is that devil in your book. He was tireless and compulsive in the use of he had very powerful hands, like the talons of an eagle.
Harry Smith's early abstractions, which is currently projected as a 16mm film that's around 26 minutes long, was originally made up of several short films, I believe 11, that were 2 and 3 minutes long each, and these were films that had been designed created or orchestrated to go with a certain beat or certain bebop type of music. It worked on the films by taking 35mm strips of bleached film and then put a piece of Scotch tape on the film. Then he would cut it with a razor blade and cut a design into it. And then
he would cover the film with Vaseline. By taking the bits of tape off, he would reveal the film and then sprayed it with atomizer that was commonly used for nasal sprays. And he would put dyes in this and then spray it on the 35mm film. Then he would pick off more of these little tiny bits of Scotch tape, and then he would spray more colors. So when the first color went down, it would be, for example, red. And then he would spray a second color of yellow. And in the places where the two colors were overlapping, he would get orange. And then he would repeat the process over and over and over again until he wound up with a really phenomenally complex, layered set of colors that were all animating. And it was a phenomenal amount of manual dexterity, and to be able to imagine that at the same time he's listening to these musical sounds, these records, and he's plotting out the entire film on 6-foot lengths of film that are going to be running at 24 frames a second. Since there's 16 frames to a foot, he's only really dealing with 86 frames, and that's not very long. So every 4 seconds or so, he's creating a sequence of images that are meant to go note for note music. And then in the early 60s, he decided to just put the Beatles on it, because he wanted to show that the films he made would go with any type of music.
That's my love. I can hide, I can hide, I can hide.
I never met the man. I'm living through the elements and the sort of residual constructs that he made, the film, like an archaeology of this man's expression. What Harry Smith did as a record collector and filmmaker was combine them into a kind of synesthesia. You know, that's what he was thinking about, total theater. With Harry Smith, visuality was a kind of a mystical realm. He always talked about folk music and recording and being an archivist of that. When you get the notion of 21st century folk culture, you got to think about access to information. You got to think about a will to change things, a will to look beyond the normal routes. Harry Smith was a precedent. I mean, most of the TV commercials or MTV issues I see of like collaged mediums and weird sounds going around. So on one hand, you have a hyper-mystical side of his sort of psychology and the notion of the lantern and the camera obscura and the projections with the soundtrack, or the, you know. But on the other hand, he was really into pop culture, and he wanted to have the Beatles mixed with Howlin', you know, Wolf or blues, or there was a will to dissolve boundaries. To me, he was pretty much the original deep multimedia guy. You know, it's like an improvisational archivist, someone who gives shape and meaning to memory. There's a guy named James Sneed, who's an African-American film critic who died a while ago. And for him, American film was mostly a conflict of the collage impulse in African culture, because it was, you know, the system of erasure that the slaves had gone through, versus the kind of formal theatrical concepts of European opera. And so cinema unfolded with that. So I like to view Harry Smith as kind of swinging back and forth between these notions of the cut-up and the collage. That's why the whole notion of him being a sort of a magus of information is a very powerful idea. That's why I'm a fan.
Today, 2 books I picked up for review at Macmillan. One is on different types of narcotics given to animals building their houses. Of course, we're all familiar how the spider given amphetamine makes it tiny, very accurate. One given, I don't know what it is, marijuana or something, makes it go this way. No, that's some kind of hallucinogen, LSD or something, but bird nests like you've never seen when the bird's high.
From interview with Harvey Bialy. It's a long list of people driven mad by Harry, like the founding editor of Biotechnology. He ran screaming from the Breslin one night after a conversation with Harry. He went stark raving mad, resigned the editorship, and disappeared into the Boston area.
I can't help but thinking of Harry and thinking of Rumpelstiltskin. He also managed to turn straw into gold.
Well, he used to have a terrible tantrum to the point where he stands on the ground so hard that the ground opens up and swallows him.
Harry used to have fits of anger like that, too.
Money, ring in false alarms to the fire department, drawing out into the street, having trucks run over it, tearing them up himself.
Joanne Zipperin told me a story that she worked for Harry film called The Wizard of Oz, and he needed help in doing it. She was helping him do some very elaborate drawing.
And then they got into some sort of squabble about some detail. And he had one of his tantrums, and he tore the thing up into a lot of small pieces. She left, but she did come back there to pick up some of her things. And there he was on the floor, putting it all together again.
That's a picture of a tormented child. Look at his face. The tree roots were torn up.
This film had no script. Piero directed me to get into the wedding gown, and then Harry would escape with me through the streets. It was one of the only films Andy Warhol himself appeared. So Andy was there, Gerard Malanga, Edie Sedgwick, Harry and I was still in the wedding gown. We wandered up to the Bowery, and the Bowery was the last refuge of the terminal alcoholics. The streets were lined with absolute derelict, in rags, stinking and covered with open sores and bruised. We looked up the Bowery and we could see so many of these men. And as we approached the first one, Harry looked at him, and then he clutched me, which he seldom did, and pushed me towards the man, and in a very almost challenging way, he looked into my eyes and he said, "Kiss him." And I knelt down in the wedding gown with a bottle of wine and kissed the man on the lips and gave him a drink from this jug. And then Harry took my hand and lifted me up and led me to the next man. No one had probably looked into their faces in years, and all of a sudden to be awakened from their stupors and see this sweet young girl in a wedding gown. What a remarkable sight it must have been. So we made our way up the Bowery, stopping and kneeling at the feet of each of these men. And as we reached the end of the street, the bottle was nearly empty, and Harry lifted it and we shared one last drink. And for the first time he embraced me fully and kissed me on the mouth and said, "Now we're married. We'll always be married. You must remember that wherever you go. You're my wife forever and ever." And he called me his wife until the day he died, 27 years later. He refined my sense of compassion. He made me aware that it is necessary to keep reminding myself to be aware every day of the delight of life, the sorrow of life, to not judge.
Harry also created a set of irregularly shaped tarot cards, one of which is used back of Aleister Crowley's Holy Books of Thelema, which he designed. He also studied the Enochian system in depth, compiling the only known concordance, forwards and reverse, of the language, from the D. N. Kelly work with the Ancients in 1581, indexed to Casabon. He made a study of the underlying principles of island tartans, correlated them to the Enochian system, and painted elemental tablets that employed both. William Breeze.
For a while, the rules and ritual systems of language became more or less conscious in Edward Kelly and Helene Smith, in the one case giving us angels and in the other Martians. In both cases, we're looking at an activity at the root of language, at the beginnings of humanity, of poetry and childhood. Harry examined the belief that reality is composed of substances that have qualities, because language has nouns qualified by adjectives, and he discovered a grammar without words, with cosmic relationships characterized by patterning. Can you see that?
Yeah.
But Harry would do things like this. He would make like his own little drawings and cards, and all that stuff has probably vanished too. He would collect all these different patterned languages, and then if you don't have a curator or somebody to come in and clean up and actually collect the stuff and keep it tidy, it just disappears. Because he wasn't interested in hanging on to all of it. He just like put it together, and then, you know, if the Smithsonian wanted to take it, then fine, get it out of here. Let's move on. He wasn't there to make the bed and, like, you know, scrub the sink. He was on to the next thing. Pardon my dust, work we must.
I woke up this morning, 4 o'clock. Mr. Case told if I'm get his bottle of hot. Put on your water, put on your coat, put your head out the window, see my drivers roll, see my drivers roll.
Well, when I left the Breslin, see, and they panicked there.
Why'd you have to leave?
I didn't have to leave. I left because I was stubborn. All they wanted me to do was move one floor up.
Mm-hmm.
But my feeling was that after I'd gone through an accumulation, for example, of boxes that hadn't been opened since 1950-something, that I might as well, you know, life was beginning over again. And I would go to the forest primeval. But it turned out to be sticks.
Do you have a place? Are you staying with somebody? Or?
Well, they kind of shuffle me around like a valuable antique, see. It's just terrible. I've been living in this, you know, Aleister Crowley temple in Park Slope. You know, the man on the top floor has Aleister Crowley's ring on. And boy, is he cranky.
Maybe that's
because
why.
They throw it on the law. That's the funny thing, that I moved out of this former mortuary, but so many people were dying there. See, in 1900, Cooperstown had 30,000 people. Now it has about 1,100 and something.
They ran him out of town. They railroaded.
At least you made it out alive, Harry. You can say you survived Cooperstown.
When did the health department declare I had to leave Cooperstown?
Yeah, the health department threw him out of Cooperstown.
Well, I was growing certain types of mushrooms out of season, and they were giving a terrible smell off. And it's taken me several months to recover from seeing the greater proportion of my geological specimens and stuff. That's why we make an interesting video to show what survived, because it's very interesting what you survive with, not what you have, how much money I have, but I mean, what do you get out of this dreadful situation with?
He probably hated everybody at that time. That's why he was always alone. He lived alone. It's that room, that alchemical room, that was where everything got ripped off.
Image of him going to the landfill in New Jersey and not finding his work and crying.
I was there only once or twice. It was amazing. I thought I walked into a medieval alchemical chamber. Glow in the dark, ultraviolet lights shining. I mean, it was something else.
In 1964, Harry left New York to go to Anadarko, Oklahoma, to work on a film with Conrad Rook. Apparently, he got in a brawl and was put in jail, where he met and proceeded to hang with a bunch of Kiowa tribesmen. That's how the Kiowa peyote recordings came about. On his arrival in New York, months later, he found that his life's work had disappeared. Supposedly, his landlord had thrown everything in the garbage. He went to the New Jersey garbage dumps, desperate for weeks, looking for it, crying. Nothing was found. This changed his life. He started drinking heavily and couldn't do any of the highly precision work anymore. A new period started.
I remember seeing him perform on them, more than a few times, and a little wand lead you through the paintings step by step, because they were, all designed to synchronize with the shapes and forms in the paintings. Quite a show. It's almost like a film, all in one painting.
Blia-ba-da-ooh-ya, blia-ba-da-ooh-ya-coo, blia-ba-da-ooh-ya, blia-ba-da-ooh-ya-coo, blia-ba-da-ooh-ya, blia-ba-da-ooh-ya-coo. Bop bop boop boop doom doobie ah bop boop da boop boop boo yeah ah bop boop dee da bop boop ba doo ba dim bloopy beep doo beep beep boop ya boop doo ba doo dee ba doo dee ba doo doo beep beep bop.
Jimbo's Bop City opened at 2 in the morning, Monday through Saturday, and the music wailed non-stop till 6 a.m. It was a favorite spot with jazz musicians, from the lowliest beginner to the grandest star.
He lived there upstairs in the apartment house. Jimbo, the owner of Bop City, owned the buildings right around there also, and I think he let Harry stay there for nothing. And Harry made those murals probably as a way of repaying him for letting him stay in that apartment for, well, it must have been a year at least. I think Harry was a great exponent of black culture, and he seemed to really feel the unfairness and wrongness that has been done to the blacks in this country. At the time, nobody that I know was all that worked up about it, but he seemed to know how they suffered, what their problems were, and what they had to offer, and he seemed to prefer their ideas to most of the people around him, He did a lot of brain drawings, and too. Well, I think the brain drawings were his way of referring to a sort of automatic drawing that allowed you to bring out deeper levels of material, another deeper dimension of creativity, and some letters that he wrote to Hilary Bay keeps referring to his experiments with creativity. I think that's what he's just learning how to release some of those inner rhythms, forms, meanings as a form of automaticism.
9 or 50, Harry got a grant from Hilary Bay of the Museum of Non-Objective Art, later Guggenheim. With that grant, he moved to New York and presented Hilary Bay with all his early work. Nothing came out of it, and a lot of these works are now lost.
An excerpt of a letter by Harry Smith to Hilary Bay, June 17, 1950. The second film, 1946 to 1948, called on the reel Message from the Sun, is an investigation of the rhythmic organization of man's mind. Just as the atom is a small model of the solar system in that both consist of a central force with circling points around it, the mind of man is miniature of a greater mind. This is part of what the Bible means by saying that God made man in his own image. This film is like the diary of the Earth's path around the sun during the 2 years I worked on it. I feel that certain forces affecting us originate in the sun. It is possible to partially explore these by comparison of creativity among musicians playing unconsciously at different angles to the sun, and also at night the forces must pass through the earth and be changed in quality for that reason. In making this film, I suppressed sensory impulses from my body as much as possible and tried to record actual daily changes in the brain. The film divides itself into two general sections. This is partly due to my being able to induce a more perfect trance state as time went on, but is perhaps also because the sun's changing position in the galaxy changes the strength of energy coming from other sections of the universe. In the film, the stationary circle with 3 squares inside it represents the brain. Changes in position of these squares are due to forces from outside the material world. The forces are represented by moving circles. Changes in color of the squares are due to messages from the material senses. The moving circles of 4 sizes and colors that precede the first statements of the brain symbol correspond to values of thought of 4 possible kinds. Identification of red, green, blue, and yellow with sections of the circle is the most important mental image known. The Tibetan mandala is a nearly perfect diagram of this sort, which is why it orders the mind so perfectly. It is less accurate than the film, however, because colors are not actual parts of the circle, but are on a coincident plane whose exact relation shifts depending on the use. Reasoning, memory, perception, intuition. This shows how the motion picture can illustrate facts known earlier but not visible except through movement.
Smith, oddly enough, realizing what a character he was, at that time he was just Smith. And he called himself a non-objective artist. And we kind of knew he was a mystical person. He really believed in coming around and learning about life until you need not come back again. In whatever form you had to come back until you realized the secrets of existence and what. Because he used to tell me, he said, "Oh man, it's all an illusion." And I'm thinking about it. He said, the whole thing is an illusion. There is nothing here except in your mind. And that was kind of hard. That was kind of hard to digest. But the more I think about it, Smith might have been right. He had a certain way about him, a demeanor that nobody would approach him except with awe and fascination. And I used to get on him. I'd say, "Hey, Smitty," or "Don't call me Smitty." That was the reaction. I used to do it just to needle him. And we used to get Smith to babysit for Percy the Third, and Jason was born at that time. And we'd leave him there working on these films, that some of these things that you see. I remember when he made these cutouts, and he started this collage business. He brought a camera that was held together by rubber bands, and June says it's by chewing gum. But he worked tirelessly on the kitchen table. And I heard boom-bee, 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 boom, this thing of Monks, over and over and over. Finally, he got a film together to present his friend, William Paley, at CBS. "Oh, I'm going to show it to Mr. Bill Paley." We said, "Oh, wow, finally Smith is going to pay back that money we've been doing." So he got this audience with his friend Bill Paley. And Mr. Paley called in all the engineers, artists, and everything connected with CBS. And they questioned Smith about how he did this. Oh, yeah. And he had a film he finished with a cat walking around the frame around the complete frame of the film. And they wanted to know how he did. "Oh, that's a collage, this is so-and-so." He explained the whole process to him. And he left there, and "Oh yes, we'll be in touch with you, Mr. Smith." They used it. He never got a call, never got a penny. And he wasn't a businessman, but he was an artist and a creator. But they really took advantage of it. Next thing you know, on the television was a bunch of commercials out with collage with things happening, just like Smith. So what took him years to develop, took him about 2 hours to steal. So he was exploited. And like it was said earlier, he really didn't care, because he said his recognition would come a long time after he had left that farm. He's probably here somewhere in another farm. Anyhow, that's my man Smith.
shameless in his begging for money, hitting up everybody for money wherever he went. See, as soon as Harry got the money and started making the films, Joanne came to me and asked me if I would give her permission to work with Harry on making the film.
Which film?
The Wizard of Oz.
I built Oz a number of times since a child. The final form was for this film. The animation stand was about the size of a floor and exactly 14 feet high. Oz was laid out on it, then 7 levels built up. What I was really trying to do was convert Oz into a Buddhistic image, like a mandala. It was divided in 4 lands. All of Bosch's paintings were carefully dissected. Another scopia, taken from the books of Haeckel, the Viennese biological artist. There was another land that was entirely made of flesh. Enormous villas for miles were made out of naked people. From Harry's interview with P. Adam Sidney.
This film had so completely changed my life. From the second that the movie was over, I was unstoppable in trying to find Harry. I immediately knew when I laid eyes on him that I was going to do everything I could to spend as much time with this guy as I could, and I did.
No, I never heard it at all till there was you.
The actual act of making the film is a process of capturing, collecting, organizing, ordering, and then manifesting. Because if you're doing animation of this type, it's a phenomenal amount of cutouts and little tiny bits of drawings and overlays and background patterns, and there's so many different things that have to be done in order to make the actual animation come across, because this is before they had computers or anything. So it all is pretty much counting on the animators to remember where they were and where they were going.
I believe that preparation is necessary.
And this process was the same as The Alchemist. And this is what Harry did forever and ever and ever. He would capture, collect, organize, and then lay them out in such a way that they would have a randomness of their own. He would collect a certain number of issues or a certain number of objects or a certain number of cutouts or a certain number of whatever. And then he would like shake them up and throw them out, just like the cards. And as they fell, he would record them.
Smith declared that my movies are made by God. I'm just a medium for them. Before I knew that Harry had said this, I'd reached much the same conclusion. His art was pure hermeticism, and he a modern Prospero. William Breeze, 1995.
I knew Harry best, second to Mr. Ginsberg. When I met Mr. Ginsberg at the end of 1949, he said, I'm going to take you to a magician. This magician lived in the meat market around, where the fuck is that? That's around the Hudson, right? I just met him, I come out of prison, and he really did dig the poetry. He didn't lie. He took me to his Mark Van Doren and all that. So Harry Smith wasn't a big deal then to me. But later on in the years, I put him up with the three I most respect in life with grand intelligence. Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Harry Smith. That's what all is dear to me. These are sharp motherfuckers. And heavy. I mean, you talk about heavy.
Heaven and Earth Magic. This film has been defined the true American Book of the Dead. Harry said he let his dreams determine its filming. He would sleep for a while and then animate them. It is an exposition of the Kabbalah and depicts the heroine's dentistry and transportation to heaven, a return to Earth after being eaten by Max Muller. This all takes place, as Harry says, in the fissures of Sylvius, one of the major folds in the brain. This is the ultimate hermetic collage. As P. Adam Sidney says, the process of animation itself, with its continual transformations, provides the vehicle for this giant equation.
It was very difficult for people to grasp like a lot of the stuff that he was trying to do with some of these more hermetic things. But I guess the idea is trying to set things up in such a way that, like through his films and some of his other projects, people would be able to then understand. Like this stuff actually has its own transformational capabilities. Just watching these films changes your central nervous system around. It enables you to see things in different ways. Harry's stuff is magical theater.
He's a major magician, but I didn't know whether he'd come to fight with me.
Reading somewhere, somebody asked Harry, "Are you a Kabbalah expert, Harry?" And he said, "Well, Kabbalah means secret, so of course not. I would give as much knowledge to anyone as possible."
Right.
Sincerely yours, Harry Smith. And don't lose anything, or I am also an expert on black magic. I had a horse and his name was Bill. And when he ran, he couldn't stand still. He ran away one day, and also I ran with him. He ran and he ran, and he would not stop. He ran into a barber shop and fell exhausted on his eye teeth in the barber's left shoulder. Oh, I went up in a balloon so big, the people down below, they looked like a pig, like a mouse, like a rat, and anything that's helpless. Okay, cut.
Mahagoni, die Netzestadt. Doch im Netz hat sich nichts gefangen.
dieses Wochenende ist ein Geschenk geworden. Nun, so werden wir.
Old Enoch, he lived to be 365 when the Lord came and took him back to heaven alive. I saw the light from heaven shining all around. I saw the light come shining, I saw that light come down. When Paul prayed in prison, them prison walls fell down. The prison keeper shouted, redeeming love I found. I saw the light from heaven shining all around. I saw the light come shining, I saw the light come down. When Moses saw that a burning bush, he walked it round and round. And the Lord said to Moses, "You's treading holy ground." I saw the light from heaven shining all around. I saw the light come shining, I saw the light come down.